Goodwood ended on the 20th of July, when Hitler was supposed to be assassinated in his wolf's lair. But not only did Hitler survive, so did Rommel. As soon as it was confirmed that Rommel was still alive, Monty launched Operation Gaff on the 25th of July by sending 6 British SAS commandos into France by parachute to kill Rommel. Having obtained a complete picture of his movements from previous spy missions, and on the 28th of July the Gaff hit team was told that Rommel was dead and Gaff returned to England. The reports written by Gaff showed how easily British spies were able to move around completely undetected in France, despite the German occupation. But that was no surprise, because the SAS secret commando squads, or special air services, would dress in German uniforms while operating in France. Monty had signed an order dated the 20th of July that read, "To kill Rommel would obviously be easier than to kidnap him, and it is preferable to ensure the former rather than to attempt and fail in the latter. Kidnapping would require successful two-way walkie-talkie communication and therefore a larger party, while killing could be reported by pigeon." Monty's Atlantic had sent the Canadians against 500 German tanks and 500 German artillery guns, and the Canadians took as many casualties as they had at Dieppe, while Monty's cadre of tanks moved towards the Germans without artillery clearing the way, and rattled forward at a fast clip in his mile-wide area without forward suppressive fire. A group of conspirators tried to kill Hitler with Stauffenberg's bomb on the 20th of July in Operation Valkyrie. And when Hitler found out that Rommel was not dead, he also found out that the British had something to do with the assassination attempt. Goodwood was supposed to make it appear that the Germans were unstoppable, so that making peace was in everyone's best interest, and a deal could now be made because Hitler was dead. In Goodwood, the Germans lost 100 tanks to the Canadians' loss of 400 tanks, and when Hitler miraculously survived the Stauffenberg bombing on the 20th of July, ruining the plot of Goodwood, Monty came up with a new plan on the 24th of July called Operation Spring, and he sent a copy to the Americans, and a copy was received by the Germans. Spring described the British doing a quote-unquote holding attack, while the Americans were doing their Operation Cobra. And then Cobra had to be postponed due to weather because the bombers could not see their targets. Monty told Hitler that Spring could not fail, that the Americans would be defeated for certain this time, and to prove Monty's loyalty to the peace proposal, the British would bomb the Americans at the opening of Cobra. Goodwood was supposed to have ended the war days before the Americans could commence Cobra, and Bradley had scheduled his Cobra for the 25th of July, so if the Americans would have refused to go along with Monty's separate peace, then the Germans would put an end to the Americans once and for all during Cobra. As it happened, when the young German soldiers heard about the attempt on the life of their beloved Hitler on the 20th of July, they began to surrender to the Americans in droves, and as they surrendered, scores of British Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons moved in to decimate them from the air. Saturday, July 22nd, 1944. The British attack with 3 armoured divisions east and south of Khan Bogdown, first because of the anti-tank screen and then because of rain. Ike visited Monty and Bradley late Thursday, spent the night back at Telegraph Cottage, having flown directly from France to Heston Airfield near Chafe, Maine, and spent the most of the day at his main office, and drove down to the camp. Yesterday he sent a letter to Monty. It recapitulates to Monty the gist of Ike's talk with him on Thursday. The theme is that military necessity dictates that in Montgomery push on with every ounce of strength and zeal, In addition to the purely military need of elbow room for maneuver, there is the political situation to consider. The home fronts of both countries are naturally becoming impatient and querulous. They see the great successes in Russia and less spectacular but steady ones in Italy, which of course is a German retreat to the Gothic line, and the progress in the Pacific, the latest being the landings on Guam announced by Admiral Nimitz yesterday. Papers are filled with the attempted assassination of Hitler, which has strong earmarks of revolt in Germany and to me is the most hopeful sign of the beginning of the end. Himmler has been placed in command of all forces in Germany, including the regular army. Dönitz followed Hitler in broadcasting assurances to the German people. Goering did likewise, but no one spoke for the army. Ike said casualties since D-Day had mounted to 110,000, of which 68,000 were American. General Ike has informed Monty, as the Army Group commander, that the time has come when the Supreme Commander must, so far as American units are concerned, permit them to be identified for publication. The U.S. War Department and the British War Office systems differ. Under the American system, the regiments in a division do not change, although in a British division the regiments may change even during a campaign. Consequently, the enemy never quite knows, in identifying a regiment, just which British division is involved. After an American regiment or division has been clearly identified by loss of prisoners to the enemy, there is no further security, and there should be no objection to publishing the names and activities of subordinate units. There may be some delay until G2 is satisfied the enemy has established identities, but the new liberal policy will permit correspondents to write news stories of unusual accomplishments of battalions, regiments, and their commanding officers. The American people have keen interest and a right to know all we can tell them about the action of their boys in battle. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 619-22. On the 1st of July in 1944, Bradley had agreed to take over part of Monty's front in exchange for a brigade of tanks. And Bradley had come up with Operation Cobra on the 10th of July, and he said it would be the decisive battle of the war, so instead of moving into Saint-Lô, as Monty demanded, Bradley had concentrated on a small corridor outside of Saint-Lô, moving his divisions at night and in secrecy before the attack, and then he planned to commit every American division to his Cobra. The British press was very gloomy when the Americans refused to follow Monty's order to attack Saint-Lô directly, and British newspapers printed stories about American overcaution and cowardice, while 2 divisions of German panzers had moved from behind Monty to set up an ambush for the Americans at Saint-Lô. That thwarted tragedy had been planned under Monty's command and described in his orders, and after Cobra, the British newspapers would report that the Americans had not followed Monty's orders to take Saint-Lô in order to intentionally slow down so more Russians would die on the Eastern Front. At high noon on the 4th of July in 1944, every American gun let go in salute, and Bradley said it made France resound in a clap of thunder, after which Bradley began denying Monty the use of American troops. Friday, July 7, 1944. Monty's confident and eloquent directives first called for an all-out slash on the British front to take Caen. The second said this effort was a holding operation to contain the German army, while the Americans took Cherbourg and resumed their push southward. Ike has been smoldering and today burst out with a letter to Monty which, in effect, urges him to avoid having our forces sealed into the beachhead, take the offensive, and Ike would support him in every way, as if it were necessary to say this. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 605. Saturday, July 8, 1944. Monty attacked northwest of Caen this morning, and early reports indicate progress, quote, according to plan, close quote. Ike has cabled General Marshall his idea for establishment of a unified command for airborne operations. Admiral King has withdrawn all American warships to the assault job in southern France. A captured German, aged 18, has told our interrogators that V2 is the rocket we have been expecting. The chemical-filled rocket on explosion will destroy by burning an area of, parenthesis, presumably, close parenthesis, 25 square kilometers. The V2s are to be fired at English ports, so our supplies will be destroyed and traffic to the continent disrupted. The prisoner said that V2 is Germany's last hope of preventing defeat. There has been a vigorous attempt in the Channel to sink our shipping by human torpedoes, such as were used at Anzio with some success. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 607. Monday, July 24, 1944. Bradley's big attack to break out of the beachhead was set to go off at 1 o'clock this afternoon, but at noon it was cancelled because of unsuitable flying weather. Some 1,600 planes, many in the air at the time of the scrubbing, had to be stopped. I went with Ike to a luncheon given him by the naval commander in charge of the southeastern ports and operations, Admiral Sir Charles Colbrook Little. It was aboard the ancient and famous flagship of Nelson, the Victory. Keel laid in 1759, finished in 6 years. The Victory was of 2,100 tons, had a complement of 850, and on her Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. She had 104 guns, 52 on a side, ignited by flintlock or match, delivering a 32-pound explosive shot, range 1,000 to 1,500 yards. One turret of a modern cruiser has greater firepower. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 622. Monty's new Operation Spring on the 24th of July would not only have won a Churchill-Hitler alliance in a separate peace, but would win an Anglo-Franco union for the British Empire, making the King of England also the King of France, while the Germans could keep their Low Countries and the Scandinavias. The Americans would be sent back to the United States with their tail between their legs, but only after using them as mere mercenaries against the Russians, and war reparations from the damage done to France and Germany would be paid for by America. The success of Operation Spring would leave the British Empire the ultimate winner and penultimate overlord, sharing the world with their German cousins. And right before Cobra, the British newspapers began a campaign against the Americans, and this propaganda would continue right up until the very end of the war. The British trusted that the Russians would happily attack Americans, provided that the Americans ever managed to reach Germany at all. And then America would be forced to fight the Russians, and after a little while the British could intervene to cut Russia a deal, if only they would agree to overthrow Stalin and restore the Russian royal family to the throne. Unfortunately for the British, Bradley was fed up with being bombed so often by his allies. So for Cobra, Bradley drew up a plan with which he was quite pleased, because the road that marked the bombing site was open and isolated and stood out clearly from the surrounding area. And Bradley had chosen this road so the pilots could see the target zone easily, and the bombers were supposed to fly in from the west, parallel to the road, and follow it to the right place where they could not possibly miss the target this time. On Monday morning, on the 25th of July, a group of British bombers flew in perpendicular instead and dropped their bombs on the Americans more than a mile from the target, and the British Air Marshal said he'd received contradictory orders and that he'd been called away from headquarters during that morning's bomb run. The following day, the British bombed the Americans again, but this time with full force, and the lead plane dropped smoke flares while the rest unloaded on the smoke. The RAF had been excluded from flying in Bradley's sector for Cobra because their planes were not designed for the smaller bombs he had requested, and 2,000 tons of heavy bombs were also dropped on areas not occupied by Germans, and the several hundred American soldiers killed included one of Ike's best generals, who was General Marshall's best friend. Ike was no stranger to suffering because his baby son had died young of a fever, and he was also an expert poker player. And 2 American Mustangs had been flying back and forth over the American troops, trying to keep the bombers away, and Ike flew back to England swearing that the British Air Command would no longer be allowed to participate in American combat. Wednesday, July 26, 1944. Ike returned glum from his visit with Monty and Bradley. High-level pinpoint bombing by American crews had fallen short, killing 36 of our own lads and wounding 80. During the evening, Bradley phoned Beadle before the further news that General McNair had been killed in a forward observation post, watching the spectacle, probably by a short. Ike was visibly depressed. But the other news Bradley phoned by prearrangement with Ike, and in an informal code system they had hastily arranged at the meeting at Bradley's headquarters, brought smiles of satisfaction to both Ike and Beadle, who happened to be in Ike's caravan when I carried in the information. After I'd got to sleep about 11:30 last night, 10 Downing phoned. The PM wanted to speak to Ike, quote, if he weren't asleep, close quote. Found Ike still awake. He told the PM that Monty now saw eye to eye with him and that he felt satisfied, but the battle was touch and go, with hard fighting underway and much more in prospect. The PM asked Ike to lunch at 1:30 today, and so he is leaving camp soon after the morning skull session in the war room, where he is at the moment. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 625. The Contentin Basin, where the Americans had been fighting, was marshland with very few roads, and the rest of the territory delegated to the Americans had been easy for the Germans to defend, a web of thick hedgerows built up over the centuries, where they could hide, staying safe and protected and having an advantage for attack. The hedgerows were dense walls of rocks and overgrown vegetation between the small French plots of farmland, and an American sergeant named Curtis from New York City, on his own initiative, devised a welded-on front fork that could break Sherman tanks through the hedgerows. Curtis used scrap metal from the Germans' underwater obstacles at Omaha Beach, and within a week more than half the American tanks had been fitted with the new device that became crucial for the success of Operation Cobra, and the man who invented it would leave a leg in the Hürtgen forest. Air support for Cobra had been designed by Bradley using American Air Force pilots in direct radio contact with his tanks for the first time, and Bradley spent a day making sure the radio signals would carry from inside the tanks, and when his experiment worked, Bradley had gained the confidence of the tank crews that could now direct bombing runs themselves instead of relying on targets picked by the British. Although Bradley's plan was meant to prevent the predictable friendly fire, the Allied air forces were still working together from London, and Monty had found out all about Bradley's plan. On the 18th of July, Bradley had gone to Monty's CP to report that he was on his way to England to brief Bomber Command for Cobra, and Bradley drew a map for them with a timetable showing how the Americans would withdraw 1,500 yards from the main road so the bombers would not miss this time. and Bradley had asked for only 100-pound bombs instead of the 500-pounders used by the RAF, so the Americans could avoid the craters made by their larger bombs that would make forward movement nearly impossible. After the RAF had bombed Caen on the 8th of July, it had taken bulldozers to fill in the holes, and Monty had settled down in Caen on the 10th of July. That had not been too unpleasant because the Germans had withdrawn before the bombing. After a day of clearing away their dead following the Cobra bombing, the Americans went forward to find that word of mouth had gotten around to the German soldiers that Hitler had tried to murder Rommel 3 days before. Half the German generals had tried to kill Hitler 5 days ago, and in disgust, German soldiers in front of Cobra started surrendering en masse to the Americans in honor of Rommel and in sympathy for Hitler. But Monty needed them to fight the Americans rather than surrendering, and many young Germans who had abandoned their arms to surrender were massacred by land and by air by the British. Monday, July 31, 1944. News reached Chafe, Maine at 11 last night that Bradley's First Army had reached Avranches, but 21st Army Group (brackets Monty) was disinclined to permit release in the midnight communique. It is announced in the noon report to the public today and may overshadow the British attack in the Caumont area yesterday, which got off to a slow but apparently satisfactory start. TJ told me of an incident which emphasizes the depth of British feeling now manifesting itself in various ways. It arises from the relatively spectacular success of the Americans in their drive down the Cherbourg Peninsula, and the relative stalemate of the British. So much news has been made by the Americans that the BBC recently has been practically all American. TJ said his hostess, who is half American, had become so irritated at the superabundant mention of American successes and absence of counterbalancing news of the British that while her American officer guests were listening to the late news, she switched off the radio. Later she apologized. Rumors in public as well as in military circles, unfortunately substantiated by our own intelligence reports, indicate that the German use of its V-2, the giant rocket projectile, may be imminent. A special crew in one of our flying fortresses flew to Poland behind German lines, landed, and picked up pieces of one of the rockets obtained by our agents. Our intelligence people deduce from these that it really weighs 50 tons and presumably carries some 10 tons of explosive which will wreck a 5-mile area. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 626-8. The footnote read, "It was Bradley's then." The following day Hodges took command of the First Army. Patton's Third was formally activated, and Bradley took over the 12th Army Group, including both First and Third Armies. Despite Patton being allowed to finally come over to Normandy on the 1st of August, Monty continued to be in charge of doling out supplies while the port of Cherbourg was getting farther and farther away from the front lines as the Americans marched towards Germany. And Monty had hoped the Americans would get stuck in Paris, that the soldiers would run amok in a party atmosphere liberating Paris, but Ike refused to go there and called it just another prestige objective. The idea was that the Americans would stay busy feeding the French in Paris long enough for Monty to do his Operation Market Garden. And as a favor to the French, Ike allowed Patton to liberate Paris on the 25th of August, but Patton ordered his troops to parade straight through without leave or liberty, because the soldiers had just learned to pronounce Rambouillet. Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division showed up the day before Patton's ground army arrived, so the French could take credit for setting Paris free. And Ike had no choice but to go along with Market Garden because supplies from Operation Dragoon an American landing in the south of France, would not reach Patton until the 12th of September, and that meant the British were still in charge of doling out supplies from the Normandy beachhead, under Monty's command, from his headquarters at Caen. Market Garden was slated for the 17th of September, and Monty launched Operation Undergo the same day by using the Canadians to attack the port of Calais. And while the city quickly surrendered, the damage to the port was so severe from aerial bombing that Calais would not be usable as a supply port until November, well after Antwerp became available. Seizing Antwerp earlier would have solved all the supply problems, because Antwerp was the largest port in the world, one of the largest ports in the world, while all the other ports the British were supposed to seize had been damaged beyond use by bombs dropped upon them from the air. Ike had sent Americans to secure Antwerp on the 23rd of August, so the Americans would have a separate supply line. But Monty had played fast and loose with them and sacrificed many good American soldiers with unreasonable orders, and Monty would not move against the Germans holding the island at the entrance to Antwerp, but would only allow the soldiers to go within shelling range. Ike had ordered Monty directly, over and over, to clear the port of Antwerp, but Monty had stalled and made excuses why it couldn't be done, and would then back it up with his horrendously bad maneuvers to prove his point. The Royal Navy had sailed into the port of Antwerp so many times in the past, such as when the British had beaten the Dutch at Texel in 1653 to win control of the entire North Sea on the 2nd and 3rd of June, which is why Churchill had been so disappointed when Ike had postponed the start of Overlord those few days before the 6th of June, and Monty needed Germans on that island for when he made his separate peace, not Americans asking for the password of the day. The problem of supplies had been exacerbated by secret British SAS squadrons sabotaging railway lines and selectively bombing trains to prevent supplies from reaching the Americans. But the Red Ball Express was succeeding in a way the British could not have imagined, and the Red Ball was driven by American soldiers of African descent eager to prove their worth, so they would emerge as victors when they went back home to America to tell their story, and making them the true heroes of saving America in France during 1944, and FDR had signed Executive Order 8802 back in June of 1941, making it illegal to discriminate against Americans of African descent when money from the government was involved, and that had fired up the Red Ball Express. The American soldiers of African descent were helped by the love the French population had for them, which was a surprising and welcome contrast to how they were being treated in America. And slavery had ended up being the most successful immigration device in American history, as there were 2 Africans in America for every 1 Irishman, 1 Briton, 1 Scot, 1 Frenchman, 1 Spaniard, 1 Norwegian, 1 Russian, 1 Pole, 1 German, 1 Hungarian, 1 Italian, 1 Chinaman, 1 Japanese, 1 Indochinese, 1 Arab, and 1 Native American Indian. In 1912, 30% of Americans had been foreign-born, and the draft for the Great War had created a melting pot of national identity. And in the draft for Hitler's war in 1942, 50% of American soldiers had failed the 4th grade reading and writing test, while so many failed the physical test that some wondered if Hitler wasn't right after all. But since FDR was himself physically challenged, he had empathy for the disadvantaged and believed in their potential, and he would not be disappointed. After the war, Mrs. Roosevelt would carry forward FDR's plans to improve America's schools. An American doctor of African descent figured out how to store blood in 1940 by separating the red cells from the plasma. And blood could now be banked that would save countless lives during Hitler's war. And Dr. Drew spent a year in England showing them how it worked, and then he went on to teach surgery at Howard University. When Patton became old blood and guts of the Third Army, he had an orderly of African origin who packed and carried his bags, while the British requested that no soldiers of African descent be allowed in the presence of British officers. The British hated the familiarity of Americans with their servants and despised the heraldry of the American common man, and they pointed to the unequal treatment of the descendants of Africans as a step in the right direction. But when the British met America's buffalo soldiers during Hitler's war, they discovered that the most ill-treated American of African descent was better off than the luckiest common Englishman. Patton had been homeschooled until he was 12 years old, and grew up looking at maps of Europe in his school books. And as a boy, he'd studied all the battles that had ever been fought in Europe, and Patton had memorized all the names of the towns in France, and knew the landscape of those battlefields as intimately as he knew his own neighborhood. Patton's dad had been a lawyer, and when he was young, Patton could recite whole pages of the Iliad and would write 2 published volumes of his own poetry. In childhood, Patton had gone with a friend to play prospector by camping out with a donkey and some beans, flour, coffee, and bacon. But they'd crept back home in the middle of the night, and this friend would later help to write The Mutiny on the Bounty. Patton learned French well enough to study the original writings of Napoleon's officers. And Patton enjoyed sword fighting, and he played polo and flew his own plane. And when he became old blood and guts as commander of the Third Army, Patton sometimes wore a green leather uniform with gold buttons, a gold belt buckle, and a gold plastic helmet, and he carried a pearl-handled pistol in a holster. Patton was helped in France in September of 1944 by such an organized thievery of supplies from both French civilians and American servicemen that the British told Ike to send soldiers to guard the supplies being shuttled illicitly towards Patton. So Patton wrote a formal letter back to the British saying that using American troops to stop the pilfering would be a waste, since they were needed instead to fight Germans. The ingenuity of diverting supplies went a long way towards helping Patton's effort, and was accomplished by word of mouth and by great personal sacrifice. General Marshall was FDR's chief of staff and faithfully watched Patton's back. And Marshall had been a company commander in the Philippines and had fought in the Great War. And Douglas MacArthur had also been in the Philippines and fought in the Great War, and MacArthur claimed to have learned to ride and shoot before he learned to read and write. MacArthur's father had been the officer in charge of 50 men in 1884, sent to protect settlers and railroad workers from the Indians in New Mexico. And in the Great War, a third of MacArthur's men died after he led them in a trench charge carrying only a riding crop, while the Germans were firing hundreds of machine guns at them, and a few weeks later the war was over. The story that followed MacArthur home was that some general had told him to either get the Germans off a certain hill or send a list of 5,000 casualties, but MacArthur had gone to West Point and knew how to fight without incurring undue losses, and MacArthur went back to become the superintendent of West Point, where his philosophy was to train officers who could lead civilians into battle. MacArthur turned West Point into a first-class university, and he changed the military atmosphere at West Point by stopping newcomer hazing. And he had the officers learn the humanities, and he even made them write poetry, while the faculty fought him at every step. and that would set up the trouble MacArthur would have during the Korean War. MacArthur let the cadets leave the campus and taught them to communicate with one another, and he married a woman he loved, and his boss sent them to the Philippines out of spite because his own superior had wanted to marry MacArthur's wife, or at least be given another chance at her, and the superior hoped that the privations of the Philippines would make her change her mind about being married to MacArthur. The American Army in 1932 was number 16 in the world, right behind Greece and Portugal, and money for the military continued to be cut in honor of the Depression. When veterans marched on Washington in 1932 to demand bonuses, the bonus marchers set up camp in tents and riots broke out, and the army was called in to clear out the bonus marchers, and MacArthur and Patton and Ike were all called in for the duty, led by General MacArthur, who gave orders to Patton and Ike because they were both majors. The Republicans cheered MacArthur for having saved America from communist agitators, and they wanted him to run for president, but FDR got elected instead because MacArthur scared people. Patton and Ike had gotten to know each other at Camp Meade in 1922, where they'd been sent to train with the new tanks. And Ike had been born in Texas before his family moved to Kansas, and Ike went to West Point and played football with Bradley in 1912. And then Ike took a convoy of army trucks from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco in 1919, where he learned plenty about logistics and motorized supply. Ike's German ancestors had come to America the year Frederick the Great was put on the throne, and they'd changed their name from Eisenhower to Eisenhower with an H-O-W rather than the original H-A-U. And their name Eisenhower in their native German meant iron worker or blacksmith. In the critical test of Roosevelt's policy, legislation to extend the military draft for 1 year and keep American mobilization on track passed the House of Representatives on August 12, 1941 by one vote. Eisenhower at War, 1943 to 1945 by David Eisenhower, New York. Random House, Jewel D. Inc., 1986, page 73. The ongoing war between the United Kingdom and the United States was evidenced by the fact that all American presidents up until 1933 had English names except for two, and McKinley was murdered in cold blood, and Van Buren had been elected in that strange year of 1836, when the Panic of 1837 would cause America to open the U.S. independent treasury in 1841, making gold the currency of choice rather than the British pound sterling. Ike would be required to stand between the hostile Germans and the equally hostile British, as both sides blamed him for getting in the way of their easy, amicable, separate peace, while there was still time and manpower available to defeat the Russians. And despite the fierce opposition from both sides, Ike marched forward into Germany because he believed in Providence with a capital P, and he knew that one must carry one's cross or be crushed beneath it. In the April Book of the Month Club News written by John P. Marquand when Harry Butcher's book first came out in 1946, printed in a format that could be pasted if desired to the flyleaf of the book, Marquand wrote, "No one who wants a first account of this country's participation in the war against Germany and Italy can afford to miss Captain Butcher's diary. Here is retailed day by day and blow by blow the story of operations as they looked at headquarters from the first concentration of forces in England to the surrender in Berlin. Captain Butcher saw the show from a ringside seat right at General Eisenhower's elbow. He has given us a unique document, untouched by afterthought or perspective, of the war's most secret moments. To read it is like living through those years again, not as an ordinary citizen, but as a welcome observer in some of the highest Allied state and military councils. What Butcher leaves unsaid can often be read between the lines, giving an almost disturbingly intimate picture of Eisenhower's headquarters and life on that high level. Though some army men already say that the Butcher book would do General Eisenhower a disservice by showing him in an undignified light, the truth is that he has already reached a point where nothing can alter his achievement or his stature. The final impression, as seen through the eyes of his friend, is that of a man who can assume responsibility, who can talk to anyone without losing his virtue or his common touch, an American of kindness, honesty, and patience, who is liked and respected not alone by his own countrymen, but by British, French, and Russians. In short, this is history in the making, and it will probably be the only source of this sort available. Diaries were not encouraged in this war, least of all on high military levels, which makes us the more grateful to Captain for keeping one, and to General for allowing him to keep it. The British practiced a strategy of good cop, bad cop, where they would ally with atrocious regimes that would become so unwelcome as the bad cop that the British would step in as the good cop to win the peace and send all the oppressive regimes packing, while the British troops stayed behind as welcome liberators. Thus, Britain usually managed to hold sovereignty over natives kept in line under the threat of the British lowering the Union Jack and inviting the Japanese or the Russians or the Islamists to take over. And in this way, the British were playing a strategic theatrical exercise, while the Americans just stuck to their ground game. FDR had shown no sympathy over Dunkirk because it seemed clear to him that the British had simply abandoned the French to Hitler, and FDR was also staunchly against any British strategy that would bolster their empire. And thus Britain needed to defeat the Americans on the battlefield by ambush and by lack of supplies and by outright betrayal. And the key to controlling the theater was mostly about controlling the supply of fuel. Diverting precious gasoline from the American army to give to the gas-guzzling airplanes that used an astonishing rate of fuel fit hand in glove with the British endgame of a separate peace with Germany, because there was no question that the people of France would beg for any negotiated end to the continual death coming down on them from the sky. The British plan was to do so much damage to the towns in Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg and France that these would welcome a British negotiated peace to end the war, no matter what the cost. And because the bombers were made in America while the targets were picked by Britain, the civilian population would readily turn against America for having destroyed their country with the Boeing flying fortresses. Bombs dropped from thousands of feet hit the target less than 20% of the time, and planes burned so much more gasoline than a battalion of tanks. And aerial bombing managed to blow up mostly empty fields, while in cities the incendiaries dropped from the sky became the weapon of choice in convincing Europe that the ruthless British were the most committed to becoming the ruling power. An hour later the all-clear came. We went up into the starlit night again. I thought that what made them so mad about an air raid was the indignity it visits on the spirit of ordinary people. They must quietly submit to an evil they cannot combat in any way. Airmen raining death on them, it is so hard for them to believe that man can soar so high and sink so low. Europe in the Spring by Claire Booth Luce, New York. Alfred A. Knopf, 1941. First published September 16, 1940, page 245. In doling out the supply of gasoline, the British could determine which armies were able to move and which were not, and the British had offered their Pluto pipeline in the planning of Overlord, or their pipeline under the ocean, and they said that Pluto could supply plenty of gasoline to the Americans, but this contribution by Mountbatten would not be completed until the 12th of August in 1944, well after the battle for Normandy was supposed to have been won, and well before a drop of fuel needed to be delivered through the Pluto pipelines. As it happened, when the war did not end in August, the Pluto tap had to be turned on, but only 8% of the total fuel used would come through, and all the rest had to be shipped by tanker or brought in by gas cans or dropped into France by airlift. From June to October in 1944, the Pluto pipelines would carry only 150 barrels per day, less than 1% of what was needed by the fighting armies. The Germans had 17 divisions against the Americans at Cobra, while another 17 German divisions remained north of Monty's territory. And a total of 65 German divisions were stationed around France and Belgium and Holland, and a division was around 15,000 soldiers, and an army was usually 2 or more corps made up of 6 or more divisions, and an army group was 2 or more armies. For Cobra, 5 square miles of hedgerows were to be bombed using 2,000 airplanes, and on the 20th of July, Ike had flown over to be part of the operation, but at midnight the British had called to say Cobra had to be postponed due to bad weather. On the 24th of July, the Cobra attack had again been called off for the 3rd day in a row, ostensibly because of the weather. While that first day Cobra had been postponed, 2 Panzer divisions mysteriously moved from behind Monty's sector to join the Germans facing the Americans. After Cobra, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau came over from America to shake Bradley's hand, and on the 8th of August, Morgenthau made a few phone calls, and on the 12th of August, Mountbatten's Pluto pipeline was finally turned on to supply a meager amount of gasoline to the Normandy theater, and that same day, Joe Kennedy's oldest son reported for duty. Roosevelt made reference to aircraft accidents in the text of his conversation. The Duke of Kent was a younger brother of the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII. His pro-German views were well known and a source of embarrassment to Churchill. He died in a plane crash during the war. Even Charles de Gaulle, once a favorite of Churchill's but later in conflict with him over de Gaulle's role in a liberated France, had the steering controls of his British transport plane tampered with. Only a delayed takeoff prevented that fatal crash. In July of 1940, at the Democratic Convention held in Chicago, Joseph Kennedy Jr. was a delegate. The elder Kennedy had been an early Roosevelt supporter and had been given the ambassadorship to England as a reward for his past contributions to the party. In this position, Kennedy enraged the British by his negative attitudes towards their government and his advice to Roosevelt not to support Britain militarily. All of the State Department cables were intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, and the American embassy in London was bugged, with the result that many anti-Roosevelt comments purporting to come from Kennedy were passed on to Roosevelt by Churchill. The ambassador was eventually recalled, and a number of post-war British writers have attempted to portray Kennedy as a German spy without the smallest degree of proof. On August 12, 1944, Joseph Kennedy Jr. was piloting a special bomber loaded with explosives. It was intended that he aim the plane at a German rocket site near the French coast and parachute out while the flying bomb continued to its target. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft exploded in midair, instantly killing Kennedy and his co-pilot. The fuses on the aircraft intended to explode the explosive cargo were designed to be activated by an FM radio beam. By coincidence, at the moment of the explosion, a British FM station, whose stated purpose was to send out false radio signals designed to disrupt incoming German V-1s, suddenly went on the air. The British later apologized for their error, stating that they were quote-unquote totally unaware of the Kennedy mission. Neither the German V-1 or buzz bomb, or the V-2, used any kind of radio control to direct them to their targets. By the time of the Kennedy mission, British experts had thoroughly inspected sufficient crashed V-1s to realize this fact, and were also aware that the V-2 long-range rocket was set on its course at launch time. No radio interception on the part of the British or Americans would have the slightest effect on the trajectory of either weapon, and this was well known at the time. In 1944, Joe Kennedy said to then-Senator Harry Truman at a Democratic strategy meeting in Boston, "Harry, what the hell are you doing campaigning for that crippled son of a bitch that killed my son Joe?" Gestapo chief. The 1948 interrogation of Heinrich Müller from secret U.S. intelligence files by Gregory Douglas of the New Mexico State University at Las Cruces, San Jose, California, R. James Bender Publishing, 1995, page 64. The footnote read, German Explosive Ordnance Navord Op. 1666, Volume 1, pages 205 to 215. After Cobra, the French locals helped the Americans capture Avranches on the 1st of August, while Ike freed Patton to come over from England. And on the 3rd of August, the Americans captured Mortain, but they were stepping right into Monty's Operation Bluecoat that had begun on the 30th of July. As Patton moved towards the main German army camped all around Monty 20 miles away, Bluecoat alerted the Germans of Patton's movements. While Hitler set off Operation Luttich or Liège the day after Bluecoat ended on the 7th of August, and Hitler personally supervised Luttich that would hit the Americans in Mortain, and these were the Germans that would get trapped in the Falay's pocket when Luttich ended in failure on the 13th of August. On the night of the 6th of August, 4 panzer divisions, using 300 tanks and 6 German infantry divisions, attacked the Americans for Luttich, and it would be discovered that the British codebreakers had copies of all the Luttich orders by the 4th of August, but had not given the Americans that info in time to warn them, so the surprise attack on Mortain took the town away from the Americans. But the 30th Division, with 1 radio with dying batteries, had kept the Germans back, as the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment held Hill 314, and they would be cut off there until the 12th of August, supplied by parachute drops, while morphine and sulfa was stuffed into artillery shells and fired over to them. Of the 700 men on Hill 314, 300 were killed, while estimates for the entire Battle of Mortain ranged between 2,000 and 3,000 American fatalities, with many more wounded. And as the Germans had begun to fail at Mortain, the RAF came in with some Hawker Typhoons to egg on the Germans and prevent them from surrendering, while the RAF 2nd Tactical kept the Luftwaffe from interfering with the RAF. Traditional accounts of the Allied fighter-bomber attacks in the Battle of Mortain accepted the claims of the pilots of over 200 destroyed German tanks. However, subsequent detailed studies of the battlefield showed that most of the destroyed German armor were knocked out by gunfire from ground forces, and that the main effect of the Allied air attacks had been to destroy the unarmored vehicles and troops in the German offensive, as well as forcing the German armor to disperse to cover. The accuracy of the rockets and bombs of the Allied fighter bombers was simply too poor to destroy more than a few of the German tanks, although fear of being incinerated inside a tank should a rocket or bomb actually strike a tank did cause some of the inexperienced German tank crews to abandon their tanks intact while under air attack. Footnote 19 in Wikipedia, Operation Lutich. In one British study, it was found that the average Typhoon pilot firing a barrage of all 8 rockets had only a 4% chance of striking a target the size of a tank. Footnote 20 in Wikipedia, Operation Lutich. Monty launched his Operation Totalize on the 8th of August, or Totalice with an S instead of a Z to the British, where Monty sent the Canadians to seize the high ground above Falaise, but it stalled in 2 days after the Americans bombed the Canadian headquarters from the air. Although some historians said with specificity that it was the RAF committing that friendly fire, and Totalize was supposed to, quote, cut off the retreat of German forces, close quote, rather than ushering them back towards the Seine to meet Monty. The Canadian commander Rodney Keller was in charge of Totalize and would be accused by the British of having lost the objective in Totalize, and the British called him a drunk and a security risk and said he was, quote, jumpy and high-strung, close quote, and called him unfit to command. And then they called him shell-shy and spread it around that, quote, Keller was yeller, and he was made to step down from any further active duty. Rod Keller would die while visiting Normandy 10 years after Hitler's war at the age of 53. And Hitler had moved 5 divisions from above Monty's sector to hit the Americans at Mortagne and Avranches. And on the 13th of August, Patton suggested driving the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. Hitler had removed the 9th Panzer Division from in front of Patton to tempt him away from Mortagne towards Le Mans during Lutich, and Hitler had sent the 9th Panzer to join the fight at Mortagne, and by the 13th of August, the German offensive was over and Mortagne was back in American hands. If the Germans had taken Mortagne, the Americans would have been cut off from their supplies now coming in from the port of Cherbourg. And when the Americans succeeded in regaining control of Mortagne, Monty sent the Canadians and the Poles the following day to link up with the Americans at Falaise on the 14th of August, and on the 19th of August, 150,000 Germans were retreating through Falaise towards the Seine River. The Poles had run out of ammunition and were fighting 7 German divisions with their bare hands that was called hand-to-hand fighting. And they were in the middle of what Monty called Operation Tractable that he had planned as soon as Totalize had failed by the 10th of August. And Tractable was sending the Poles and what was left of the Canadians to seize the high ground above Falaise that Totalize had failed to do. As with Totalize, the first day of Tractable saw the RAF bomb the Poles and Canadians from the air, while the night before Tractable, a Canadian officer had lost his way while moving between divisional headquarters and drove into the German lines where he was promptly killed, and the Germans discovered a copy of the complete orders for Tractable on his dead body. Thus, the Germans had been able to put their most lethal force in front of the Poles and Canadians when they kicked off at noon the next day under fire from 800 Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers, while the German forward positions also inflicted heavy casualties upon them. The Poles and Canadians moved forward for the next week towards their objectives until they were spread out, and then they ran out of ammunition on the 20th, and at this point the Germans counterattacked, allowing the 9th and the 2nd Panzer Divisions to march out of the Falaise pocket towards the Seine River, where they could rest and refuel, while those left behind had largely surrendered to the Americans, and by the 23rd of August, the Germans who had retreated could join those prepared to attack the Americans, entering Paris on the 25th. The Falaise pocket was caused by a gap only several hundred yards wide, and on the 21st of August, when the Poles and the Canadians met Patton's army at Falaise, there had been great concern that the Poles and Canadians would mistake the Americans for Germans as they met to close the gap, and friendly fire coupled with misdirected airstrikes would have wiped out Patton's army. But the Americans figured out a secret way to prevent that. Falaise was in the British zone, and so Patton ignored that fact and went 10 miles into British territory to meet the Poles and Canadians. And Monty ordered him to back up, but Patton ignored him, because the 1st of September was rapidly approaching, when Monty would lose his right to command the Americans' ground game. And that day couldn't come quickly enough for Patton, who knew that Monty had intentionally allowed all those Germans to escape out of the Falaise pocket so they could dig in and make themselves comfortable. At the beginning of Tractable, the Canadians had been given the same yellow smoke to identify their positions as was being used by the aerial bombers to mark their targets. And the Canadians, bombed by friendly fire on that first day, lost 1,500 men wounded and 500 killed. And the day after Tractable had been launched on the 14th at noon, Ike kicked off Operation Dragoon on the 15th of August, and Dragoon was about landing the American army on the Mediterranean beaches in southern France to open a supply route northward so Patton would no longer be dependent on supplies from the British. The problem of supplies was the lifeblood of the war, and without gas and food and ammo, armies could not march. And the original plan for Overlord had the Americans using only the ports of Cherbourg and Brest, while the British would use Antwerp and Normandy. Dragoon had originally been called Anvil, and had been agreed to in the original Overlord, but it had been cancelled without American consent. And with the Americans more firmly in control of the theater after the failure of Operation Totalize, the American army would land in Marseille on the 15th of August, despite British objections. Stalin had insisted on Anvil, and Monty had demanded that Anvil be cancelled, and Dragoon had initially been planned for the same time as the D-Day landings, but the British had called off that part. And Churchill came over to visit Bradley on the 7th of August to convince him not to go forward with Dragoon, and Churchill made his appearance on the last day of Bluecoat and the day before Lüttich and Totalize would begin. When I pointed toward the rapid movement of our armored columns towards Brest, Churchill placed a stubby finger on that port city. "The garrison here," he said, "will die like flowers cut off at their stems." Then with a nod toward the blue tabs that hung from the map beyond the corner at Avranches, where we held a 20-mile gap between the German 7th Army and the sea, Churchill asked, "Divisions?" "Yes, sir," I answered. "We've passed a dozen of them through." "Good heavens," he continued, "how do you feed them?" And he pointed to the lone primary road that ran through that narrow gap. "As a matter of fact, sir, there are 2 roads," I explained. "The other is a secondary route. We run trucks over them, bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day." Churchill called for the black leather dispatch case carried under the arm of his naval aide. He fumbled with a key on his watch chain and opened the case to reveal a box of Havanas. After lighting one, Churchill carefully deposited his used match in a corner and began to talk with animation of a possible diversion of Devers' forces. Devers's forces. Why, he growled, why break down the back door when the front door has already been opened by your magnificent American army? Rather than become involved in arguing an issue that was properly the business of Scaife and the combined chiefs of staff, I listened but did not reply. When at last he finished, the Prime Minister slumped in his chair, looked over his spectacles, and said questioningly, "But of course I'm not at all certain that change at this late date is advisable." Again I did not reply. Fortunately, the change was not made, and Anvil, now renamed Dragoon, went off on schedule. Bradley, page 365 and 6. Patton had asked Bradley on the evening of the 12th of August if he should go north to close the Falaise Gap, and Bradley told him that Monty was sending the Canadians to do that. But the Canadians had met heavy German resistance they almost didn't survive, and had then used their yellow smoke when told that bombers were on the way to help them. 9 German divisions escaped through the gap out of the Falaise pocket, guarded on their way by Model, sitting between them and Monty, and by this time 1/3 of British casualties had been Canadians, and the air forces had flown 500,000 sorties and lost 17,000 airmen, along with 4,000 planes, and an estimated 20,000 French civilians had been killed, with many more wounded, and the Germans had lost 150,000 men, with 10,000 killed in the Falaise pocket alone. At this point, Ike had to argue with Monty about the boundary line dividing the Americans from the British, because Patton had gone over into Monty's territory in closing the Falaise Gap, and Monty would still be in command of the Americans for 10 more days, and had big plans drawn up that included ordering the Americans to march into Paris. And some historians said that Monty had seasoned troops held in reserve that he could have sent to help the Canadians, rather than just complaining about their poor performance. Patton was supposed to have stopped at Argenton, 12 miles south of Falaise, and Falaise was 20 miles south of Caen, and the Seine River was 70 miles away, and Paris was 100 miles away. And Patton told Bradley, "Instead of waiting here for Monty, we ought to get moving again. There's nothing out front, nothing at all between me and the Seine." Bradley, page 374.